What happens when one of music's most beloved icons sits down with daytime television's most controversial panel? You won't believe what unfolds when Janet Jackson faces off against The View hosts in what starts as a routine promotional interview, but quickly spirals into television's most explosive confrontation of the year. Before we get into this incredible story, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below because you're not going to believe what unfolds. The atmosphere in the View studio felt different from the moment Janet Jackson walked onto the set. The legendary performer there to promote her upcoming documentary series carried herself with the grace and poise that had defined her decades-long career. But beneath the polished exterior of daytime television's most watched talk show, tensions were already simmering that would soon boil over into an unprecedented on-air meltdown that as Janet settled into her chair. The hosts exchanged glances that viewers at home couldn't quite read. Whoopi Goldberg, sitting at the head of the table, had that look in her eyes that regular viewers knew meant trouble was brewing. Joy Behar was practically vibrating with an energy that suggested she had been waiting for this moment all morning. Sunny host sat rigid, her legal background evident in the way she was already formulating her attack strategy. Sarah Haynes tried to maintain her usual bubbly demeanor, but even she seemed to sense that this interview was about to take a turn that nobody had planned for. The opening pleasantries felt forced, almost performative. Janet spoke warmly about her upcoming projects, her voice carrying that familiar warmth that had endeared her to millions of fans worldwide. But the hosts weren't really listening. They were waiting for their moment to pounce on the real reason they had invited her on the show. It wasn't about her music, her legacy, or even her documentary. They had an agenda, and Janet Jackson was about to find herself in the crosshairs of The View's notorious political machine. So, Janet, Whoopi began, her voice carrying a deceptive casualness that anyone familiar with her interviewing style would recognize as dangerous territory. We've been talking a lot lately about artists and their responsibility to speak out on social issues. Your brother Michael, your family, you've all been in the spotlight for decades. Don't you think celebrities have an obligation to use their platforms more responsibly? The question landed like a grenade in what had been up until that moment a relatively peaceful conversation. Janet's smile flickered for just a fraction of a second, but she maintained her composure. I've always believed that artists should be authentic to themselves and their beliefs, she replied carefully. I've spoken out on issues that matter to me throughout my career, from social justice to women's rights. Joy Behar leaned forward, sensing blood in the water. But have you really, though? I mean, we've seen so many artists lately who claim to be activists, but then stay silent when it really matters. Like, where were you during the last election? We didn't hear much from you when democracy was literally on the line. The accusation hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Janet's publicist, sitting just off camera, shifted uncomfortably in her chair. This wasn't what they had been told the interview would focus on. This was supposed to be about Janet's artistic journey, her personal growth, her upcoming projects. Instead, the View hosts were treating her like a defendant in their personal courtroom of public opinion. I prefer to let my art speak for itself, Janet responded, her voice still measured, but with a slight edge creeping in. I've been making music with messages for over 4 decades. Songs like Rhythm Nation, That's the Way Love Goes Together Again. These weren't just entertainment. They were statements about unity, about healing, about bringing people together. Sunny host jumped in with the precision of a prosecutor delivering a closing argument. But unity with who exactly? Because it seems like when push comes to shove, when the country was facing real threats to democracy, to voting rights, to women's reproductive freedom, we didn't see Janet Jackson on the front lines. We saw a lot of other artists stepping up, putting their careers on the line. But you seemed to stay pretty quiet. The studio audience, which had been warmly receptive when Janet first walked out, was now sitting in uncomfortable silence. You could feel the energy in the room shifting, becoming charged with a tension that made everyone present aware they were witnessing something unprecedented. This wasn't an interview anymore. This was an ambush. At Janet's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Her hands, which had been relaxed in her lap, now gripped the arms of her chair. I think there's a difference between being performatively political and genuinely caring about issues, she said, her voice taking on a steel that longtime fans would recognize. I don't think artists should be obligated to perform their politics for public consumption just to satisfy other people's expectations of what activism should look like. The words hit the panel like a slap across the face. Joy Behar's eyes widened, and she let out a laugh that sounded more like a bark. performatively political. Are you serious right now? We're talking about basic human rights, about democracy itself, and you're calling it performative. Sarah Haynes, who had been trying to steer the conversation back to safer ground, found herself getting swept up in the hostility. I think what my colleagues are trying to say is that with great platform comes great responsibility. You have millions of fans who look up to you, who might have voted differently if they had heard from you. So now it's my fault how people vote. Janet's voice was rising now. The careful control she had maintained starting to crack. I'm supposed to tell grown adults how to think, how to vote, how to live their lives. Is that what you think artists are supposed to do? Whoopi slammed her hand on the table, the sound echoing through the studio like a gunshot. When fascism is knocking at the door. Yes. When women's rights are being stripped away, when voting rights are under attack, when marginalized communities are being targeted, then yes, people with platforms have a responsibility to speak up. The confrontation was escalating rapidly, spiraling beyond anything the View's producers had anticipated. Behind the cameras, staffers were exchanging panicked glances, unsure whether to intervene or let this explosive moment play out. The audience sat frozen, some looking genuinely uncomfortable, others leaning forward with the morbid fascination of witnessing a train wreck in real time. Janet Jackson, one of the most successful recording artists in history, a woman who had broken barriers and challenged conventions throughout her career, was being lectured about social responsibility by a panel of talk show hosts who seemed to believe they held the moral high ground simply by virtue of their political opinions. You know what Janet said, her voice now carrying the full force of her decades in the entertainment industry, dealing with critics, controversies, and challenges that would have broken lesser artists. I find it interesting that you invite me here supposedly to talk about my work, my art, my upcoming projects, and instead you ambush me with this political purity test. Is this how you treat all your guests, or just the ones who don't toe your particular political line? The question hung in the air like a challenge, and from the looks on the hosts' faces, it was clear that Janet Jackson had just crossed a line that they never expected one of their guests to cross. But as tense as things had already become, this confrontation was far from over, and what happened next would shock everyone watching. Joy Behar's face flushed red as she leaned back in her chair, clearly taken aback by Janet's directness. Excuse me, a political purity test. We're asking you about basic human decency, about standing up for what's right. This isn't about politics. This is about morality. Morality according to who? Janet shot back, her voice gaining strength with each word. According to you, according to this panel, you sit here every day telling people what to think, how to feel, who to vote for, and if someone doesn't fall in line with your exact worldview, you attack them. That's not journalism. That's propaganda. The studio erupted in a low murmur of gasps and whispers. This was unprecedented territory for The View. Guests simply didn't talk back to the hosts like this. They certainly didn't accuse them of being propagandists on their own show. But Janet Jackson wasn't backing down. If anything, she was just getting started. Sunny host's legal training kicked into overdrive as she tried to regain control of the narrative. Janet, I think you're deflecting from the real issue here. We're not asking you to be political. We're asking why you chose silence when your voice could have made a difference. When kids were being separated from their families at the border, when women's reproductive rights were under attack, when voting rights were being systematically dismantled. Where was Janet Jackson? Where was I? Janet's voice rose to a level that made everyone in the studio sit up straighter. I was making music that brought people together. I was supporting causes that I believed in privately without making a spectacle of myself. I was living my life according to my own values, not performing them for your approval or anyone else's. Whoopi slammed her palm on the table again, this time with even more force. Private support doesn't help people who are suffering. Private support doesn't change laws. Private support doesn't save democracy. And public grandstanding does. Janet fired back immediately. Because from where I'm sitting, all your public support, all your daily lectures, all your moral superiority hasn't changed much, has it? The problems you're so passionate about are still there, aren't they? Maybe the issue isn't that I wasn't loud enough. Maybe the issue is that your approach isn't as effective as you think it is. The words hit the panel like physical blows. These women were used to being the ones asking the tough questions, the ones holding others accountable. They weren't used to having their own methods and motivations questioned by someone sitting in the guest chair. Sarah Haynes, desperately trying to salvage what was left of the interview, jumped in with what she clearly hoped would be a more diplomatic approach. Janet, I think we can all agree that we want the same things: equality, justice, fairness. Maybe we just have different ways of working toward those goals. But Janet wasn't interested in diplomatic solutions anymore. The gloves were off, and decades of frustration with the entertainment industry's political expectations were pouring out of her. Do we want the same things, Sarah? Because it seems to me like what you want is for celebrities to be your personal cheerleaders, to validate your political positions by repeating them back to you on cue. You don't want independent thinkers. You want performers who will perform the politics you approve of. Joy Behar couldn't contain herself any longer. That is so incredibly naive. Do you think this is a game? Do you think politics is just some abstract concept that doesn't affect real people's lives? People died because of the policies we were fighting against, and people died while you were fighting against them, too, Janet responded with ice in her voice. So maybe your fighting isn't as effective as you think it is. Maybe instead of attacking artists for not being political enough, you should be asking why your own political activism has been so unsuccessful. The studio fell into a stunned silence. The audience looked shell-shocked. The hosts looked like they had been physically struck. This was supposed to be their domain, their turf, their rules. But Janet Jackson had just flipped the script entirely, turning their own accusations back on them, and exposing what she clearly saw as the fundamental hypocrisy of their position, that Whoopi's voice, when she finally found it, was dangerously quiet. So, you're saying that fighting for justice, fighting for equality, fighting for democracy is unsuccessful. You're saying that standing up for marginalized communities is pointless. I'm saying that lecturing people on television every day isn't the same thing as actually fighting for anything, Janet replied with devastating precision. I'm saying that attacking other people for not being political enough isn't activism, it's performance. And I'm saying that maybe if you spent less time criticizing artists for their supposed silence and more time actually listening to what their artist is saying, you might understand that there are many different ways to make a difference in this world. The confrontation had reached a boiling point that no one in the studio had seen coming. What had started as a routine celebrity interview had exploded into something much more profound and disturbing. A complete breakdown of the usual power dynamics that govern these kinds of interactions. Janet Jackson, one of the most successful and influential artists of her generation, was systematically dismantling The View's moral authority on live television. But the hosts weren't ready to surrender their platform without a fight. And what came next would push this already volatile situation to its absolute breaking point. Sunny host's voice cut through the tension like a blade, her prosecutorial instincts taking full control. You know what, Janet? I think I understand what's really happening here. You're deflecting because you know we're right. You know that when it mattered most, when your voice could have made a real difference, you chose your comfort over other people's lives. And now you're trying to make us the villains for calling you out on it. The accusation was so personal, so vicious that even the usually unflappable Janet Jackson visibly recoiled. But instead of backing down, something shifted in her demeanor. The diplomatic facade that had been cracking throughout the interview finally shattered completely. My comfort. Janet's voice was now razor-sharp, cutting through the studio with surgical precision. You want to talk about comfort? Let's talk about the comfort of sitting behind this desk every day, collecting your paychecks, lecturing people about morality, while contributing absolutely nothing to the causes you claim to care so much about. At least when I make music, I create something. What do you create besides division and outrage? Joy Behar's face contorted with rage. We inform people. We educate. We fight for democracy every single day. You fight for ratings every single day. Janet corrected with devastating calm. You manufacture outrage for profit. You turn every issue into a performance, every tragedy into content for your show. And then you have the audacity to lecture artists about using their platforms responsibly. Look in a mirror. The words landed like bombs. Whoopi Goldberg, who had built her entire career on being the unshakable moderator who could handle any situation, looked genuinely rattled for the first time in recent memory. That is completely out of line. We have spent decades fighting for the things we believe in long before this show even existed. And what do you have to show for it? Janet asked, leaning forward in her chair with the confidence of someone who knew she had just gained the upper hand. Decades of fighting, decades of lecturing, decades of moral superiority, and the problems you're so passionate about are worse than ever. Maybe the problem isn't that other people aren't loud enough. Maybe the problem is that your approach doesn't actually work. Sarah Haynes, looking desperately uncomfortable, made one last attempt to salvage the situation. Janet, I think we all want the same things. Can't we find some common ground here? But Janet was done pretending this was a reasonable conversation between reasonable people. Common ground. Sarah, your colleagues just spent the last 20 minutes attacking me for not performing my politics the way they think I should. They accused me of valuing my comfort over other people's lives. They called me naive and irresponsible. And now you want to find common ground. The time for common ground was before you decided to ambush me. Sunny Host wasn't finished. Nobody ambushed you. We asked you legitimate questions about your responsibility as a public figure, and you turned it into an attack on us because you can't handle being held accountable. Accountable to who? Janet's voice rose to fill the entire studio. To you who made you the arbiters of social responsibility? Who gave you the authority to determine whether my contributions to society are sufficient? You sit here every day judging everyone else, but who judges you? Who holds you accountable for the damage you do with your constant negativity and division? The question hung in the air like a weapon. For once, the View hosts seemed genuinely speechless. They were used to being the ones asking the hard questions, the ones making others uncomfortable. But Janet Jackson had flipped the entire dynamic, and they had no idea how to respond. Whoopi, clearly struggling to regain control of her own show, tried one more time. Janet, this is exactly the kind of divisive rhetoric. That divisive, Janet interrupted, her voice now carrying the full force of 4 decades in the entertainment industry. You want to talk about divisive? You've spent this entire interview trying to tear me down because I don't agree with your political tactics. You've accused me of being selfish, naive, irresponsible, and morally deficient. And I'm being divisive for defending myself. She stood up abruptly, her microphone still attached, her voice carrying clearly throughout the studio. You know what the real problem is? The real problem is that you think anyone who doesn't march lockstep with your political agenda is automatically wrong. You think that loudness equals effectiveness, that moral posturing equals actual morality. But here's the truth that you can't handle. Your way isn't the only way. And your voice isn't the only voice that matters. Joy Behar was practically shouting now. So what? We should all just stay silent while democracy dies. We should all just make pretty music while the world burns. Janet turned to face her directly, her composure completely intact despite the chaos around her. Joy, democracy isn't dying because artists aren't political enough. Democracy is dying because people like you have turned politics into theater, issues into entertainment, and real problems into content for your television show. You've made politics so toxic, so performative, so exhausting that regular people don't want to engage with it anymore. The words seemed to physically stagger the hosts. This wasn't just a disagreement anymore. This was a complete rejection of everything they believed about their role in society, their importance, their effectiveness. Sunny Host made one final desperate attempt. That is absolutely ridiculous. We are fighting for justice, for equality, for your fighting for relevance. Janet cut her off with finality. And you're losing. With that, she reached up and removed her microphone. The small action somehow carrying enormous weight in the moment. The studio was dead silent except for the faint hum of the cameras that were still rolling, capturing every second of this unprecedented meltdown. Thank you for having me on your show, Janet said with perfect politeness, her voice now eerily calm after the storm of the previous minutes. This has been very educational. She turned and walked toward the exit, her heels clicking against the studio floor in the absolute silence. Behind her, the host sat frozen, clearly unsure whether to try to stop her, call for a commercial break, or simply let her leave the edge of the stage. Janet paused and turned back one final time. I came here to talk about my music, my art, my upcoming projects, things that bring people joy, that unite them, that inspire them. But instead, you wanted to talk about politics and division and anger. I think that says everything anyone needs to know about the difference between us. And with that, Janet Jackson walked off the View set, leaving behind a panel of hosts who looked like they had just survived a natural disaster. The cameras continued rolling for several more seconds, capturing the stunned faces of Whoopi, Joy, Sunny, and Sarah as they sat in complete silence, processing what had just happened at in the end. Janet Jackson had done something that very few guests in The View's history had ever managed to accomplish. She had turned the tables completely, transforming from victim to victor, from defendant to prosecutor. She had exposed what she clearly saw as the fundamental hollowness of their moral authority. And she had done it with the kind of devastating precision that only comes from decades of experience handling hostile interviews and difficult situations. The confrontation was over, but its impact would resonate far beyond the confines of the studio, leaving viewers with a perfect example of what happens when manufactured outrage meets genuine authenticity. And authenticity wins.